Well, welcome to everybody. Wherever you are in the world, we seem to have a very good audience this afternoon. Not unsurprising, but very encouraging that we do. So I'd like to introduce my good friend and fellow enthusiast for the postal history of the Falkland Islands. We went down there together about 8 years ago. Many of you will remember Kim in his presentation on the trans-Antarctic expedition. So I'm probably a bit biased, to be honest. He's a man of many philatelic interests, of which this afternoon's subject is just one. And he's a very good researcher. So I've got great expectations, and over to you, Kim.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk about what you might not have heard very much about, the very secret service of the UK, the British Post Office. In 1929, and that's going back quite a long way now, the British Post Office was very concerned about the high value items that came from banks, and they were mainly packages of banknotes, and they were going through the ordinary registered mail service. So they formed a committee to formalise how these packages should be handled, both on the receipt at the remote post offices where they were received, and then how you dealt with them, mainly in the London sorting offices. That's where the bank headquarters were. In February 1930, it was proposed these parcels would be classed as high value packets, or HVPs. They would be registered, but in addition would bear this special red label inscribed HVP, and they'd be closely monitored and documented while they were in transit. They'd also be enclosed in special green mail bags to make sure that they were carefully looked after. Very importantly, and amazing to think of in this day and age, no additional charge would be made for this service to the banks, and that remained true until 1966. Special instructions were set up on how the packets were to be handled, and they would use the secure railway travelling post office carriages for the longer journeys. So this very secretive, high-value packet service came into operation, being announced in a post office circular of the 11th of June 1930, and it began on the 16th of June. Now, I have to admit, as we look through these items, if this was an exhibit, there may be some question marks over condition. A lot of these items are package labels thrown into mail bags and saved at the bank destinations. However, they may score highly on rarity. Not much material, as you can imagine, escaped from the banks that use this very secret service. The HVP system was set up for the whole of the UK, but interestingly, the Scottish banks, after expressing their initial interest, decided that the registered post, coupled with their own insurance, would cover their needs, and it would cause them less work. So as a result, the service really only covered mainly England and Wales. A service from London to Belfast was included in the scheme, but was only a one-way service. The details of the scheme are outlined in a small operations manual I have that's pre-World War II, and you can see the front cover of it on the top right there. This has been updated through until about 1965. From that booklet at the left-hand bottom left of the page, I've taken an extract from it. You can see that a certificate of posting for an HVP package should be marked, as in the case shown here, with an oval HVP cachet. We also see one of the very early items of HVP mail from the 1930s. Here, 4.8 halfpenny pays the registered 2-ounce HVP rate from Portsmouth to the very small Lloyds Bank branch at Tottenham Bay. It's on the Isle of Wight, close to the well-known Needles. I mentioned that the red HVP labels, if available, should be stuck to the package. And this did seem to happen in most cases of the examples I've got. Here's a sheet of labels and a close-up of a single label. As I mentioned, travelling post office or TPO carriages would carry this mail, as shown on this advice slip from the Crewe to Bangor TPO. And you can see there were special instructions if the HVP packages didn't travel by TPO. Now, an interesting question is, how does an HVP package get from the sorting office to the bank? Well, it isn't via the postie. Authorised bank staff or their agents had to sign for and pick up the package from the sorting office, which might well be in London, be Mount Pleasant Post sorting office. We also see here some early 1930s again, George V HVP usage, with a 1936 envelope of 6 ounces to Lloyds Bank in Ipswich, a 12-ounce envelope to Westminster Bank in Guildford, and finally a fragment for a parcel package cancelled in Gloucester in 1938, where £1 shilling and 10 pence pays for £4 8-ounce registered package rate. Here we see George VI usage showing the use of express service as well as registration, and that was sometimes used. This is cancelled with a London Threadneedle Street registered oval cancel. London East Central Mount Pleasant office was the most likely receiving and sending destination for HVP packages on their way to the head office bank head offices. These packages were carried from the train stations in guarded and alarmed post office vans. This made them an attractive target for thieves, which happened at 4:20 in the morning on the 21st of May 1952. On Eastcastle Street, which you can see here, just off Oxford Street, a post office van was diverted by roadworks, and it was travelling from the Paddington to the city, and it was sandwiched between 2 cars. The driver and 2 guards were dragged out and attacked, and 18 of the 31 mail bags were taken. It appeared that there could be inside assistance, as the van's alarm was tampered with, and the procedures for handling the van's keys had not been followed. So this was a typical robbery that took place in the 1950s. In total, £287,000, which is about £9 million now, was stolen in HVP packages, and they were never recovered. The post office report about it said, precautions for the transport may not necessarily work, as they say, whatever protective or preventative measures are suggested in the matter of HVP mail vans, none will be of the slightest use unless supervising officers ensure that they are carried out. We then get to the start of the 70-year reign of Queen Elizabeth II and the introduction of her first definitive series, the Wildings. Here we see a registered envelope to Midland Bank in Llangollen, Denbighshire, with a nice use there of the Wildings Symphony. You can also see the registered and HVP labels on the front. The weight of this package was £5 8 ounces. By the way, on weight, it obviously will vary with which denominations are packed, but something like a £5 parcel might contain about £5,000 in used banknotes. Here's an example of 2 labels that have multiple interests. The upper pair showing the front and reverse are probably parts of 2 labels that were on the original parcel. This one with the address and stamps, the other with the HVP label and registration. It also shows a nice combination of the QE2 Threepenny Wilding with the Festival 2 and 6pence before the Castle high values were issued in September 1955. It's cancelled in London on the 27th of July 1955. The front and reverse of the lower label shows all the information for the package. As you can see, it's quite crowded with the registration label overlapping the HVP label. So by now the Castle issue was available. So the 5 shilling Castle and 1 3pence Wilding pay the £5 registered rate. Looking at this Martin's Bank label from head office, it's worth hearing a fascinating recollection from the Martin's Keighley branch around this time. George Dale was the chief cashier at Keighley during the 1950s and 60s, and it showed maybe what a different time it was. I'll read it out. In those days, Tuesday was the day that surplus or old banknotes were dispatched to the head office in Liverpool. This was done by the way of high value packets. Each packet contained £5,000, carefully parcelled and sealed with wax by the chief cashier. George would depart on foot to the post office with one parcel under each arm, accompanied by a junior male clerk. The duo would leave the branch on the dot at 11:50 a.m. to ensure the parcels could be deposited with the post office in time for him to catch his bus home for lunch. Most of the town was aware of this routine, but no attack was ever threatened. Maybe different days to what we have now. Now, on the 28th of March 1949, the HVP service at last reached Scotland, but it was only for transfer between London and major cities such as Edinburgh and Glasgow, Dundee or Aberdeen. For transfers between banks in Scotland in the 1950s, the Scottish banks were still just using the registered mail service. Here on the right are two uses of the scarcest wilding that we see in use, the 11pence. In addition, you can see the halfpenny being used. Here, 5 and 5pence halfpenny paid the postage for £5 and 6 ounces of banknotes from Gillane, East Lothian in January 1956. Also, 4 shillings 11pence halfpenny pays £3 14 ounce post from Harbour, Kilcoldy in the 12th of January 1956. Another scarcer use wilding is the 7penny value. Here on the left, it pays 7 and 7pence for £7 8 ounces of banknotes, a large amount, going from Portree on the Isle of Skye to the Bank of Scotland in Edinburgh in 1956. As can be seen from this letter from the Scottish Postal Board headquarters, I'd say it took from 1930 right the way through to 1961 for the HVP service to be extended to the whole of Scotland. In 1960, the HVP service was extended to send packages from the major cities to the Scottish Bank headquarters, which were mainly in Edinburgh. The service was finally extended, as I say, in March 1961 for the banks in the rural areas of Scotland to send notes back to head office. Of course, 3 banks are issuing banknotes: the Bank of Scotland, the Royal Bank of Scotland and Clydesdale Bank. The instructions for this HVP service were the same as those in England, with the use of the red HVP label on packages, close auditing of the passage of the package and pick up from the sorting office. Now, there's much more Scottish bank material than English bank material available for philatelists, and this is almost single-handedly due to the efforts of the late Professor Mike O'Hara. Mike also unravelled the pricing structure for the different time periods for the HVP service when pricing did get introduced. Without his efforts, our knowledge would be a lot less. Now, how did this all come about? Well, Mike's day job was a professor of geology, and he was a professor at Edinburgh University when he was appointed as NASA principal scientist in the UK to study the lunar rocks returned on the Apollo 11 through 17 missions to the moon. Now, you can imagine if you've got a lunar rock in your possession, it's quite valuable. So he found out about the HVP service when he approached the Royal Bank of Scotland for vault facilities for storing the items. And he saw in the vault a large pile of discarded package labels from HVP packages. Being a keen philatelist, here was an opportunity not to be missed, and he received a steady stream of items in return for contribution to the bank's Widows and Orphans Fund. Unfortunately, much of the material was destroyed in opening packages and tearing labels. It was also the days when having a stamp cut off an envelope was much nicer than the whole envelope itself. A typical delivery of material is shown in the picture here, dumped on the living room floor in the 1970s. As I said, Mike was very interested in the analytical side of the HVP service. But in the next few slides, I want to also show you some of the beauty of combinations of stamps used to pay for the HVP service, particularly in the 1960s and early 1970s. Being in Scotland, you can see the Scottish Regional Wildings that were first issued in 1958 being used. But it's pretty scarce to see the lower values being used. Of course, they're really only make-up values for an HVP charge. The threepenny value is represented here by a pair on an HVP label for a £5 package of banknotes from Newton Moore in 1969. Interestingly, I haven't seen the Scottish Regional sixpenny on an HVP label yet. Let me know if you've seen one. There's a fourpenny value here shown on a label from Aviemore paying the £3 charge in 1970. And you can see also a low value Machin tuppenny. Again, these low value Machin and UK Wilding values weren't easy to find on HVP labels. Finally, the fivepenny Regional Wilding is shown on a piece from a parcel for £4 of banknotes from Broadford in 1970. The similar coloured ninepenny and one and threepenny Regional Wildings are illustrated here. Broadford on Skye provides the source of this wonderful parcel piece on the right, with a pair of ninepennies helping to pay for a large £9 package of banknotes, which cost £3 1 and sixpence in January 1971. To the top left, we have a label for a parcel of the same weight, this time again in January 1975 and from Arbroath. Finally, bottom left, we have a nice label with two 10-shilling castles and a pair of the Scottish 1 and 3 values, paying for a £3 parcel from Perthshire in August 1969. Finally, in looking at Scottish Regional Wildings, we come to probably my favourite match pair of labels. They are very attractive for their block of 1 and sixpenny Scottish Regional Wildings, but also the matching blues of the change from the 10-shilling castles value to the high value large Machin stamps that were issued in March 1969. I should say that studying this period of HVP usage in Scotland in the 1960s gives some incredible combinations of stamps that we'll see going forward. All these are often in combinations that vary, and we'll see those. Both these labels, as you can see, pay £1 9 shillings for a £4 packets of banknotes. The castles from North Berwick in June 1969. The Machins are from Perth in December 1969. As I've also said, the low-value sterling Machins that replace the Wilding stamps are not easy to find on HVP labels. But here are two examples, and they're using different coloured 8penny Machins. I'll try and explain why. £6 of banknotes cost £2 2 shillings to send, and here two post offices used 3 8penny stamps to pay the 2 shilling element of that charge. Even though the sending dates were just one day apart, the 9th and 10th of July 1969, Actorada post office only had the old 8penny vermilion Machin. Now this 8penny stamp needed a colour change in early 1969, as the vermilion colour was now being used for the fourpenny second class stamp. This meant a new turquoise 8penny Machin being issued, and you can see it here used from the North Berwick post office. Here's an interesting set of 3 labels that showed the introduction of the high value 2 and 6 and pound Machins across different post offices as stocks ran down. The high value Machins were issued on the 5th of March 1969 with 4 values, the 2 and 6, 5 shilling, 10 shilling and £1, and of course they replaced the iconic Castles set. £1, 2 and 6 paid the £3 HVP rate, allowing various combinations of £1 and 2 and 6 values. Perth had the new 2 and 6p value in use 14 days after issue on the 19th of March 1969. Grantown on Spey, however, in August 1969, still had the old castle's 2 and 6p, but had the new £1 Machin value. And by the time we get to March 1970 in Aviemore, only the high value Machins are available. Here you see the change in use of the 5 shilling and 10 shilling castles to the Machin equivalents. These match labels again are for a £5 parcel. The castles label is sent from Newton Moor in May 1969. The Machin label in September 1969 from Avoc. This is the best example of the transition from castles to Machins, because here we're talking about it's the same combination of values paying the £9 parcel rate, and it's from the same post office, King Street in Aberdeen. This shows the timing of the end of the castle's supply. In July 1969, the castle's £1 was still being used 4 months after the issue of the high value Machins. However, by the time the second £1 label was being sent in March 1970, it was exclusively Machins that were being used. On June the 17th, 1970, so some 15 months after the issue of the sterling Machins, 3 high-value Machin decimal values were issued in preparation for decimalisation in February 1971. At the same time, a redrawn £1 value was issued. This meant you could have labels with both sterling and decimal high-value Machins at the same time. But these will gradually be replaced by labels with all decimal high values before the decimalisation day in February 1971, as I mentioned. This is usefully shown here by the 2 labels from the same post office for a £5 HVP packet that costs £1, 15 and 6p. In August 1970, Avoc had the 10 shilling Machin high value. By November, these have been replaced by the 50p value. Now, looking at each of those new decimal Machins in turn, we see 2 examples of the 10p decimal value in use. Now, this equates to 2 shillings in sterling, where there had not previously been a single stamp of this value, so it's quite a useful stamp to have. Both these examples here are on a £4 HVP package, needing £1 and 9 shillings to pay the franking. 2 10p values pay 4 shillings for that franking. They're also interesting, so you might notice they were posted on the same day, the 18th of August 1970, from the same Actorada post office and have consecutive registration numbers. The label on the left uses 2 10 shilling Machins, the other a single £1 value. Now, maybe this was to avoid having the package being too large, that they split it into 2 packages that were sent out. And as Mark Bailey pointed out to me in rehearsal for this, the 5 shilling value on the right has an additional piece of the adjacent stamp. You might see it over the £1 value there, which actually equates to the missing piece on the 5 shilling value on the left. So they were adjacent 5 shillings that were used. So that's quite interesting there. Here's the 20p label in use. Both labels paying the £4 HVP fee of £1 and 9 shillings. The left-hand label is posted in 1970, September, from Kirkwall. The right-hand label in November 1970 from North Berwick. We've seen low-value Machins used before on some labels. They're not easy to find, but here is a 1 shilling value being used in conjunction with a pair of 20p Machins. Finally, for the high-value decimal Machins, we come to the 50p value. Both these packets were sent in 1970 in July. And this time a £5 package was used, costing £1, 15 and 6p. In both cases, we see a low-value 6p Machin was used rather than the 6mm Scottish Regional Wilding. I've mentioned that before. I haven't seen the Scottish Regional Wilding in use. The label was sent from Aviemore, and the parcel using an economy address label was sent from Lauder in Berwickshire. We've seen use of Wildings, regional Wildings, castles, sterling Machins, decimal Machins on HVP mail. What you don't see very often is the use of UK commemoratives as a make-up value on these packages. But here we have two examples using the 1 shilling Prince of Wales investiture commemorative. Firstly, there's a large parcel of £7 of banknotes sent from Macduff, Banffshire on the 12th of August 1969. It uses a 1 shilling commemorative to make up the posting rate. What it also shows is what shouldn't be used, which is a large rectangular parcel cancellation. It shouldn't really be used on HVP mail, as the package should always go through the letter post rather than the parcel post. But obviously the cancel was very useful to cancel all those stamps at once. The second HVP use on the left here is a £3 package costing £1 2 and 6, sent 1 day later on the 13th of August from Perth to the Bank of Scotland head office. Now, we talked about the attacks on mail vans in an effort to get hold of currency and HVP packages that were going through the post. The post office was concerned about security, and they issued this security booklet in 1962. And even as they say themselves, it covers in understandably vague detail about the increased security that was needed on post office vans and travelling post offices. And it recommends security that be taken in different situations, such as at post offices and on train stations, as you can see at the bottom left. Particular attention was paid to the travelling post offices that carried the HVP packet mail. A lot of additional security was added to 3 HVP coaches, such as bolts, catches, bars over the windows. But on the morning of Thursday, the 8th of August, 1963, all 3 of these new carriages that they had prepared were out of service for maintenance, amazingly. An older reserve TPO carriage was put into operation. And this was the train from Glasgow to Euston. It was also just after a Scottish bank holiday, so the amount of HVP mail that was being carried was far higher than usual, being transferred to London. The TPO coach was carrying 128 sacks of HVP packets, all with noticeable and easily identifiable red label HVP labels attached. It was the Great Train Robbery. Now, apocryphal story was that Ronnie Biggs told them to look out for all these packets that had these red labels on. So 636 of these high-value packets were stolen in the robbery. The money enclosed in the missing packets was 2.6 million, equivalent to over £45 million today. The banks offered an unprecedented £250,000 reward for information about the robbery. I quite like the fingerprint dust that you can still see on the HVP carriage that's pictured here. Five days after the robbery, the gang's hideout was discovered at Letherslade Farm in Oakley in Buckinghamshire. Their Austin Lodestar lorry and 2 Land Rovers, which police believe were used to carry the haul from the train to the farm, were discovered there. And you can see they also were thinking they were going to be holed up for a long time because there were supplies discovered at Letherslade Farm. Fingerprints were found on the Monopoly set that they played with and a ketchup bottle. So after the police had finished, by the way, Letherslade Farm was open to sightseers by its owner, who charged £0.50 for adults and £1 for children. Now here's a photo on the bottom left there of some of the sacks recovered from the cellar at Letherslade Farm and some more of the discarded HVP packages. Obviously from the opening of them, none of the Great Train Robbers was a philatelist. The bulk of the money was never recovered, only about £400,000 worth of the 2.6 million. And only a few of the banknotes were ever identifiable by serial number. On the 9th of August 1963, the day after the robbery took place, Post Office officials addressed outstanding security issues on the TPOs. Immediately, one of the out of service HVP carriages was returned to service, and inquiries were instituted as to why all three happened to be out of action at the same time. An additional carriage was created as well, and all bolts and fittings were improved and inspected. And the installation of radios, previously rejected as too expensive, was immediately identified as a priority. And you can see there some more items that were exhibits in the from the Great Train Robbery. Now, as I said earlier, it took from 1930 until 10th of January 1966 for the Post Office to make a charge for the high value packet service. Until then, items were carried in the registered mail at registered mail costs with the registration fee. As we've seen one example, occasionally an express fee was added for that additional service. However, as you can see from the table, there was a rapid escalation in the HVP charge from 2 shillings per pound up to 4 6 per pound. So this meant that the bank started to look for alternatives. This includes, on the right, a Bank of Scotland bullion van made for transfers to head office. And of course, the other thing that was happening was the rapidly growing business in security transit. This meant further pressure on the viability of the HVP service. As we went into the 1970s, we started to see more use of meter marks used to frank the mail. This occurred both in London and Edinburgh. There's two separate put together fragments of security tape from Barclays Bank with a meter mark on them. And NatWest had a dedicated HVP postage meter with an integrated HVP marking as the cachet. This seemingly massive increase in technology was somewhat offset by the fact that metering was still in UK old pence. So 504D that's on this meter label here equated to £2 and 2 shillings for a packet of £6 in weight. This was from the 23rd of March 1970. On the right hand side, we have an example here of Barclays combining their meter mark with Perfin 9penny BBKs, they say on the stamps, for Barclays Bank stamps. It's interesting there that probably the stamps therefore were applied in the bank. Maybe those 9pennies have been held back for payment for overseas mail. After decimalisation, the HVP service in Scotland also continued with the regional decimal machins as shown here. Also in Scotland, there were experimental tripartite registration labels used with head office names only, NO for number, and 6-digit numbers introduced in Scotland in November 1972. It seemed this experiment wasn't much of a success, but here you can see the top part of a label being used on a parcel from Inverness to head office in Edinburgh. So the HVP service was officially abolished in England and Wales on the 31st of October 1973, when the service was taken over by security companies. And of course that continues until this day. HVP, however, carried on in Scotland for about another 2 years, until August 1975, during which time a new scheme was set up called Bankers Special Packets, or BSPs. The BSP service began operations on the 18th of August 1975. No special labels were used for this scheme, but we had seen hand stamps BSP in 3 sizes, and they've been seen on packages. Otherwise, a handwritten BSP might be written on the package, and that would suffice, as shown here. This BSP service in Scotland carried all the way through until 1998. The 12th of October 1998 was when the combined registration fee was replaced by the special delivery next day services, and that's when the banker's special packet service ended in Scotland, and we have the last of the special bank service. Well, what about the Republic of Ireland? They used the registered mail service to transfer banknotes, and again, travelling post offices carried the bulk of mail. This provided us with the Great Train Robbery in England, a juicy target for the thieves. Salim's train robbery occurred in Ireland on the 31st of March 1976, when the Cork to Dublin mail train was robbed near Salim's in County Kildare. Approximately £200,000 was stolen from 11 registered mail bags. The banknotes mainly belonged mainly to the Allied Irish Bank and the Bank of Ireland. The Ulster and Northern banks also had a few branches in Cork. So even in Ireland, the TPOs and bank mail was very attractive as a target for thieves. So here ends our review of the Post Office's very secret service. It's just worth looking at where else in the United Kingdom the service operated, as the focus here to date has been very much on England and Scotland. The HVP instruction manual, you can see at the bottom left, states the service operated in the Isle of Man. Well, that certainly seems to be the case with this close-up top left here of one of the items stolen in the Great Train Robbery. As you can see, there is a Douglas Isle of Man registered label on this parcel to the National Provincial Bank in London. And it may be the only way to see an Isle of Man example. There's also a letter here from the Northern Ireland Postal Board to Mike O'Hara, outlining the service that operated there, mainly being from items from London to Belfast. It's interesting in this letter and others I have that the postal staff themselves even had very little knowledge of the service that had existed just a few years previously. The HVP manual also stated that the service operated in the Channel Islands. Again, Mike O'Hara wrote to the postal administrations of both Guernsey and Jersey about the service, and again received quite a vague response. I do not believe that an HVP package to or from the Channel Islands has been seen, but again, I would love to be corrected on that. So as I say, here ends our look at the Post Office very secret service. I'd like to thank a few people. Bill Barrell actually passed on a lot of the late Professor Mike O'Hara's documentation to me. I read on the website the late Les Wilkinson provided information on HVP. And Maurice Buxton also sent me some images of earlier HVP mail to use with others in the presentation. I hope you've enjoyed this look at the Post Office's very secret service. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. Excellent. And the good news is that we have some questions for you, which I will come to. We've got a couple actually, and the first one is from Ingo Nessel, who's in Canada, and he says that he noticed an HVP hand stamp on a registration label.
Yeah.
He said these seem to be scarce. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, they are.
Okay.
That's the only example I've seen.
Okay. Right. Good. Well,
I mean, we are banks intrinsically are quite security conscious, as you can imagine, and therefore not much escaped from the banks. People tended to cut items off parcel labels, as you could see from the pile that was on Mike O'Hara's floor there, but much of the, let's call it documentation, such as registration labels, receipts, were not really part of what escaped.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Well, Mike Roberts has actually raised a question which is quite interesting. He said obviously that many of your labels that you've shown, particularly in Scotland, are plainly used for the sending of used notes to head office.
Yeah.
Early in the presentation, 2 examples were seen from Martin's Bank head office to Ambleside and Preston.
Yeah.
Mike's question is, what was the likely content? Would it have been new notes?
It could well be new notes. Yeah, if they're using the HVP service, it's likely to be new notes.
Okay. And at the moment, the final question I've got is from Stephen Parkin. Stephen asks, was the HVP service used just for banknotes, or was it also used for the transmission of travellers' cheques as they were issued by the bank?
I haven't seen that in the instruction manual. I will have a look through those, Stephen, and let you know, but I haven't seen that. It's a very good question. What's it limited to? I will check on that. In reading it, I haven't found that, but I may have missed it.
Allied to that, Ian Gregg asks, was gold sent by the service?
Again, I don't know if bullion was sent. Again, I will check whether it clearly states that other items could be sent. I mean, banknotes was why it was set up. But it's good questions, yeah.
I did notice, just on the topic of things that would have been carried by the service, I did notice when you showed us the pile of stuff on somebody's floor, I think you said it was on Professor O'Hara's floor.
Yeah.
That amongst it there was a torn label that mentioned so many pounds of silver coin.
Yeah. Yeah, I think coins would have gone, but why is an interesting question.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously in Scotland especially, you've got the different bank note issuing banks, and there has to be some repatriation of all that and old notes, etc. as well. But why coins, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Oh, just a thought, post-decimalisation, they did start withdrawing the old silver coinage pre-1947, I think. So it might be something to do with that.
Yep.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Okay.
And a supplementary question from Ian, really. He says, well, did the service also deal with foreign notes, in terms of foreign exchange?
I would suspect foreign notes would be included if I think, especially if it was going to head office in London, that might be the case. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so that was the final question that I've seen. So I think, Mike Roberts, over to you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Kim. Before I thank you formally, I'm aware that certainly in the 60s and 70s, there was no gold bullion that was transferred using this service. It was all done separately between the Bank of England in London and the various Bank of England branches, of which I think there were about half a dozen then. And that was all done under armed guard. I shouldn't have said that, I suppose, but never mind.
It was part of your stake for the robbery.
Just being arrested now. Anyway, it's not often you come across a subject where you've got a clear beginning, a middle, and a clear end, and you can go through it all very thoroughly. And that's what we've had, a very clear explanation from start to finish, with all the reasons, special arrangements, different approaches from Scotland, And incidentally, I haven't found anything from the Channel Islands. Very topical robbery examples. And couldn't have done it without reference to the Great Train Robbery, which I can still remember. And a great display of items with attractive combination of stamps, and then you go on to meter marks. And you've done it with all the basic instructions and who was interested and why and what. So thank you really very, very much indeed. It's been a really good lecture, and I hope that a lot of people have probably learned quite a bit. So thanks very much, Kim. And if I could now ask our President, Peter, if he could present you with your virtual certificate.
Yes, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Just now, there were 100 people on this video, which was really very impressive. It's certainly the first time I've ever seen 100 on one of these meetings, and I'm delighted that, Kim, you have managed to attract so many people. Perhaps we're all interested in money, and just hoping that we walk outside and find a packet with HPV on it in a green bag, inviting anybody in the world to know that that was the one to steal. I love it. I have to say that your idea that life was a great deal more honest and safer in the 1950s than it is now, I think is probably wishful thinking. But certainly the post office thought so anyway. Anyway, I was delighted to be able to take part today. I'm actually at the Royal. You may see I haven't got my characteristic old bit of rag hanging behind me. For me, I remember the Great Train Robbery with great delight, because I was actually at Oxford at the time, and we were only a few miles away. So we cycled out after they'd discovered the place and had a quick butcher's at the Letherslade Farm. And of course, there must have been somebody inside all that. I mean, the whole of the arrangements that there were, you know, one can imagine that the engineers who messed up the trucks so that they couldn't run on that day must have got a pretty good hand back. And I understand, I think, was it somebody called the Ulsterman who was thought to be the chief of the insiders? There was a man called the Ulsterman, and he was never named and never caught.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Certainly, I agree with Malcolm that it would have been I'm sure it would have been the silver coinage being transported back. Solid silver up to about 1920, and then half silver up to 1947. Half crowns and florins and things. Anyway, it's not for me to rabbit on. It's for me to say thank you very much indeed, Kim, and to present you with a certificate, which I have here. And I've no doubt that Mark should have it by now. Have you got it, Mark?
I have indeed. I'll put it on the screen now.
Thank you very much. There we are. And the ink is barely dry. But, delighted that I've been able to present that to you this afternoon. And thank you very, very much indeed for all the members and non-members. And those of you who are not members of the Royal but have enjoyed this afternoon, there is an opportunity to tick a box which says, I'm interested. So please do, if you're interested in knowing more about the Royal Philatelic Society London and perhaps wanting to join up, then please don't hesitate. You will be very welcome indeed. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Peter. And the good news is that a few of our guests today have done exactly that. And we will be communicating with them, explain to them how they may join us. So yeah, thank you. Mike.
Mark. Well, I suppose at this stage, we quite often have a number of informal discussions and maybe supplementary questions. But that does conclude the formal part of the afternoon. So I guess we could stop recording. And thank you very much, all of you, for attending.